He grabbed her wrist so hard she felt the bones compress. Not a warning, not a threat whispered behind closed doors. His hand locked around her arm in the middle of the supply corridor on the fourth floor of Hanseong Medical Tower, 1:47 in the morning, and he squeezed, the way you squeeze something you believe belongs to you. "You think anyone's coming for you?" Director Cho said. His breath smelled like cigarettes and the particular confidence of men who have never once been told no. "You think anyone in this building even knows your name?" She didn't answer. She had learned over 6 weeks that answering made it worse. He released her, smiled, straightened his badge, and walked away like nothing happened. If you have ever been invisible in a place that was supposed to protect you, if you have ever documented every wrong done to you and watched it disappear into silence, this story is for you. Hit the like button. Drop your city or country in the comments right now so I can see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next in that stairwell at 2 a.m. will change everything. And I promise you, you do not want to miss a single moment of what's coming. So, the notebook was running out of pages. That was the thought that moved through Amara Bennett's mind as she pressed her back against the cold concrete wall between the 4th and 5th floors of the emergency stairwell, her breath coming in slow, deliberate pulls because she had learned the hard way. The only way anything gets learned in a place like this, that the sound of crying carries farther than you think in a building full of echoes and silence. The notebook was a composition book she had bought at a pharmacy near her apartment in Mapo-gu, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that costs almost nothing and means even less to most people. She had filled it with 6 weeks of documentation, dates, times, direct quotes, reproduced as precisely as her memory allowed, in the minutes immediately after each incident. Names of people who had been present, names of people who had looked away. A diagram, embarrassed in its smallness, a hand-drawn box representing the supply storage room on the 4th floor, the position of the camera. She had noticed 2 weeks in that had been rotated slightly, just slightly, so its angle no longer captured the area near the shelving units where Director Cho liked to position himself. She had noticed that. She had drawn it. She had written the date the camera moved and the date she noticed the camera had moved and the difference between those 2 dates, which was 11 days. She was 26 years old. She was from Baltimore. She had a supply chain management degree from a state school that nobody at Hanseong Medical Tower had ever asked to see because her job didn't require it. And she had taken the contract position in Seoul because her older sister Danielle had dared her to do something that scared her, something real, something that would mean she'd actually lived before she turned 30. That's how Danielle talked, in sweeping proclamations about living that made more sense when you were sitting on Danielle's front porch in August drinking sweet tea than they did when you were crouched in a Korean hospital stairwell at 2 in the morning with someone's fingerprints already bruising into your wrist. She should call someone. She had thought this before. The specific, practical version of the thought, call someone, had occurred to her approximately 40 times over the past 6 weeks, and each time it arrived, she walked it through the same sequence. She could call the HR department's overnight line, which rang to a recorded message that instructed callers to submit a formal complaint through the employee portal, which she had done twice, and both submissions had been acknowledged with an automated confirmation email and then nothing. She could call the security desk at the building entrance, which was staffed overnight by a guard named Mr. Yoon, who had been working at Hanseong Medical Tower for 19 years, and who, the 3rd week she'd been there, had told her in careful, polite English that Director Cho was a very important man and that perhaps she was misunderstanding Korean workplace culture. She had not been misunderstanding Korean workplace culture. She had been experiencing a man who grabbed, cornered, and threatened, and she knew the difference because the difference is not cultural. It sits in the stomach, cold and particular, and she had known it the very first time. She could call her contract agency. The agency had placed her with a 6-month contract. She was in week 6. The restructuring that Director Cho had mentioned, offhandedly, almost gently, in the way that people mention the weather, when what they're actually doing is describing your future, was scheduled for the end of the quarter. She had done the math. The end of the quarter was 19 days away. She could call her sister. She had almost done this 4 times. Each time she had stopped herself because Danielle would fly to Seoul on the next available flight using a credit card she couldn't afford to max out, and there was nothing Danielle could actually do here. And the image of her sister arriving at Incheon Airport, furious and helpless on Amara's behalf, was somehow the worst version of all the bad outcomes she had cataloged. So she sat in the stairwell. The fluorescent light 2 flights above her hummed at a frequency that she had started to associate with the specific texture of dread, the low-grade constant kind that doesn't spike, just sits. The notebook was pressed against her thigh. Her wrist ached where Director Cho's hand had been. She was thinking about the camera, not the camera in the supply room, the one she had already documented. She was thinking about the camera in the main corridor on this floor, the one that she had noticed during her 3rd week was positioned to capture the entrance to the stairwell. If someone had been watching the feed tonight, if someone had been paying attention, they would have footage of Director Cho following her from the storage area. They would have footage of him grabbing her in the hallway. They might, if the angle was right, have footage of the exact moment he let go and smiled. The problem was that the footage was controlled by the hospital's internal security system, which was managed by a department that reported to hospital administration, which meant it reported, ultimately, to people who had spent 19 years telling a front desk guard to remind foreign employees about workplace culture. She opened the notebook anyway. She wrote the time, 2:04 a.m., and the location, emergency stairwell between floors 4 and 5, and the date. She described what had happened in the storage room and in the corridor in as much detail as she could recall. She wrote the exact words he had said. "You think anyone's coming for you. You think anyone in this building even knows your name." She described the pressure on her wrist using words that would hold up: sustained, deliberate, released slowly. She wrote that she had not responded verbally. She wrote that she had exited via the eastern stairwell access door at approximately 1:52 a.m. She was mid-sentence. Subject smiled prior to departure, showed no indication of distress or concern, which is consistent with previous incidents documented on pages, when she heard the door open above her. Her whole body locked. Not the door from the 4th floor, the one from the 5th. The sound was different. She knew these sounds now. She had cataloged them the way she cataloged everything, with a specificity born from the understanding that knowing your environment precisely is one of the few forms of control available to you when other forms have been taken away. Footsteps. A man's weight. She could tell from the sound, from the particular weight of each step on the concrete stair, which was not the light footfall of the overnight nursing staff she occasionally passed. Heavy. Unhurried. The footsteps of someone who was not rushing because he did not believe he had a reason to rush. She pressed against the wall. The turn of the staircase meant she wasn't visible from 5 flights above. She wasn't visible from 4 flights below. But she was visible from approximately 3 steps above the landing between floors 4 and 5, which was where the footsteps were about to arrive. She didn't move. Moving would make sound. Sound would announce her before she could think. The footsteps stopped. A pause. 4, 5 seconds. Long enough that she felt each one distinctly. Then a voice said in Korean, "Why is the light on this landing different from the others?" Not to her. She processed this first. Not to her. There was a second person. She hadn't heard a second person, but then the first voice hadn't been raised or addressed outward. It had been the particular register of someone speaking to someone near them. A murmur. The second voice responded, also in Korean, too low for her to parse. The first voice said something else. Then the footsteps resumed, slower now. They were coming down. Amara made a calculation in approximately 2 seconds. If she moved now, if she went back through the 4th floor door, she would be moving toward the floor where Director Cho was. If she stayed, whoever was descending would reach her landing in under a minute. If she went lower, down toward the 3rd floor, she'd be moving away from both. But the 3rd floor access door required a keycard clearance level she didn't have on her badge. She stayed. The footsteps came around the upper bend of the stairwell, and the man who appeared at the top of her landing was not what she expected. She didn't know what she expected. A security guard, maybe. Another administrator working late. What she got was a man in a dark suit that cost more than her monthly contract stipend, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from long practice at being in rooms where being calm is required for your survival. He was Korean, mid-30s, with a face that was not remarkable except for the eyes, which were the particular eyes of someone who processed information faster than he let on. He saw her immediately. She had pressed herself into the corner of the landing, notebook against her chest, an instinct, absurd in retrospect, as if covering the notebook would make her less visible. and she knew she must look exactly like what she was. A woman hiding in the early morning hours in a hospital stairwell, afraid. He stopped walking. The man behind him, younger, larger, the particular posture of someone whose job is to be physically prepared, stopped too, one step higher. The man in the expensive suit looked at her, not the way Director Cho looked at her, that particular attention that made her feel reduced, assessed, targeted. This was something else. He looked at her the way someone looks when they are trying to understand what they're actually seeing before they do or say anything at all. She didn't speak. Her Korean was functional, survival level. She could navigate convenience stores and transit systems and medical supply manifests. She did not have the vocabulary for this. He said something to the man behind him without turning around. The larger man stepped back up the stairs, out of view. The man in the suit crouched down, not toward her, not closing the distance between them. He simply lowered himself to her level, his forearms resting on his knees, so that he was no longer standing over her the way everyone in this building stood over her when they thought they could. He said, in English that was careful and slightly formal in the way English sounds when someone learned it correctly rather than colloquially, "You are injured." Not a question, not "Are you injured?" He had already decided. She looked at her wrist. The mark was visible even in the stairwell's ungenerous light. She pulled her sleeve down. "It's nothing," she said, "because this is what you say." Because in 6 weeks she had learned that the fastest way to make an encounter end was to make yourself smaller and simpler and less complicated than you actually were. He didn't agree or disagree. He said, "It is 2 a.m. You are in the stairwell. The 4th floor access keycard was used 6 minutes ago on the eastern entry, and the same card was not used on any other floor." He paused. "Yours is the only personnel ID logged in this zone." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because," he said, "this is my building." The sound of the fluorescent light above her, the one she had associated for weeks with the specific frequency of dread, suddenly meant something entirely different. She looked at him, at the suit, at the absence of any hospital badge or administrative lanyard, at the way the younger man behind him had moved, not like a colleague, but like protection. "You own the hospital," she said. "A corporation I control owns a majority interest in the company that operates this facility," he said. "My name is Kong Min Jae." The name did not mean anything to her. She would learn later exactly what it meant. But in that moment, what she heard was that a man with resources and authority had his eyes on her, in a place where she had spent 6 weeks being invisible, and she did not yet know whether that was a rescue or a new category of danger. She said, "I want you to know I have everything documented." Something moved across his face, not surprise, something closer to recognition. "Show me," he said. She didn't move immediately, because this was the part she had rehearsed in her head, the version where someone finally asked. And in every rehearsal, she had imagined relief, had imagined the loosening of the tension she had been holding since week 1, and what she actually felt in this moment was not relief at all. It was a complicated, layered exhaustion that had been waiting for exactly this moment to finally show itself. She held out the notebook. He took it with both hands. A small thing, a gesture, the particular care of someone who understands that objects can carry more than their physical weight. He opened to the first page. He read. He turned to the second page, the third. His expression didn't change the way most people's expressions change when they read something upsetting. There was no performance of reaction, no audible response. He simply read, with the focused attention of someone processing evidence rather than absorbing a narrative. He read for a long time. When he looked up, he said, "You submitted complaints through the internal HR portal. Twice. You spoke with building security. Once. The guard told me I might be misunderstanding workplace culture." A pause. Something in his jaw tightened. The smallest possible movement, so restrained it might not have existed. His name. Director Cho Sang-hyun. He's the overnight supply department head. And the camera, this diagram. He indicated the page. You noticed the repositioning yourself. Week 3. I measured the original angle against the new one using the supply cart I park in the same spot every shift. The cart's the same distance from the lens both times. The angle changed. He looked at her for a long moment, not assessing her the way Director Cho assessed her. Something harder to name. the look of someone recalibrating what they thought they understood about a situation. "You kept all of this," he said, "for 6 weeks, alone." "Yes." "Why didn't you go to the police?" The answer to this was complicated. The simplest version of it was that she was a foreign contract worker in a country whose language she didn't fully speak, employed through an agency in a building controlled by people who had already demonstrated they were capable of making her documentation disappear. The longer version involved her understanding that the police were not magic. They were an institution, and institutions responded to power and evidence and the particular weight that some people carry in rooms and other people don't. And she had watched her notebook get lighter with each entry, while the power on the other side of the equation had not shifted at all. She said, "I was building a case." Min-jae nodded slowly. Like that was exactly the answer he expected, and the answer he was not willing to dismiss. He stood. He held the notebook for a moment, looking at it rather than at her, and she had the sudden terrified instinct that he was going to keep it, that she was going to watch this document, this object that had consumed 6 weeks of her life and preserved the specific shape of every indignity she had endured, disappear into a man's pocket in a stairwell at 2 a.m. He held it back out to her. "I need to make some calls," he said. "You don't have to go back to that floor tonight. My associate will arrange for you to wait somewhere safe until—" "I'm not going anywhere with your associate," she said. The sentence came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't take it back. He looked at her. "No," he said after a moment. "That's reasonable." "I don't know who you are." "You know I own the building." "That's not the same thing as knowing you're safe." Something moved through his expression again, and this time she could identify it, because she had seen it before in exactly one other context, and that context was a mirror. It was the look of someone who recognizes a sentence they themselves have thought, in a different form, at a different hour. He said, "Then stay in the stairwell. I'll be back in 20 minutes. He turned and went back up the stairs. Not fast. Not as if he was escaping the conversation, as if the decision had already been made and speed was not required. She sat with the notebook in her hands, and the bruise building on her wrist, and the fluorescent hum above her that now, for the first time in weeks, had a slightly different quality to it. Not exactly hope, because she had learned to be careful with that word, but something. The barest, most fragile beginning of a shift in weight. She opened the notebook to the next blank page. She wrote, 2:31 a.m. Encountered individual identifying himself as Kong Min-jae in Eastern Emergency Stairwell, between floors 4 and 5. States he controls majority ownership of building through corporate entity. Reviewed notebook, did not photograph or copy. Returned document, made reference to outgoing calls. She paused. Then she wrote, "He crouched down. He didn't stand over me." She stared at those words for a while. Then she closed the notebook and waited. He came back in 18 minutes, not 20. Amara noticed that. She noticed it the way she noticed everything now. Not because she was paranoid, but because 6 weeks of documentation had rewired something in her, made her clock the small details that most people let slide past without examination. 18 minutes meant he had made his calls quickly, or his calls had been short, or the people he called picked up immediately. Any of those 3 options told her something about the kind of man he was. He came through the 5th floor door this time, descending toward her landing rather than ascending from below, and he was alone. No associate. She had said she didn't want the associate, and he had apparently taken that seriously enough to leave the man wherever he'd been stationed. He sat down on the step above her landing, not beside her, above, which should have felt threatening and somehow didn't, because he left the space between them intact, and he was looking at the middle distance rather than at her. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay." "The complaints you submitted through the HR portal, the dates." She told him. Both dates, from memory, because she had written them down so many times that they had become structural, like her own address. He was quiet for a moment. The first complaint was reviewed by a departmental manager named Park Seon-woo. He flagged it internally and recommended no further action within 48 hours. He paused. The second was rerouted before it reached the review stage. The system logged it as a duplicate submission and auto-archived it. She stared at him. "It wasn't a duplicate." "No, it wasn't." Someone changed the classification. Someone with back-end access to the HR system changed the classification. He looked at her then, directly. That's not a department manager. That's administrative access at a level that requires either executive clearance or IT cooperation. The stairwell felt colder than it had a minute ago. She pulled the sleeve of her uniform down over her wrist. The bruise had settled into a dull, heavy throb that she had been ignoring with the specific practice discipline of someone who has learned that acknowledging pain in the moment is a luxury she couldn't afford. So someone buried it deliberately, she said. Yes. Someone with authority. Yes. She let that sit. Then, how do you know all of this? It's been 20 minutes. 18, he said. And I know it because the people I called have had access to this system for longer than tonight. He said it without apology, without the particular discomfort that most people would layer over an admission like that. He said it the way you state a fact that is simply true, regardless of how it sounds. You were already watching the hospital, she said. I was watching anomalies in operational reporting that suggested someone was managing information flows in ways they weren't authorized to manage. A pause. I was looking for financial irregularities. I found something different. You found me. I found a pattern of access suppression that coincided with overnight staffing on the 4th floor. He looked away again. You accelerated the timeline. Amara turned that over. She accelerated the timeline. 6 weeks of sitting in this building carrying a notebook that was running out of pages, and what she had actually been doing, without knowing it, was stumbling around inside someone else's investigation, like a woman walking through a minefield in the dark. Except the mines had names and HR access codes, and a camera they had repositioned 11 days before she noticed. I want to know something, she said. Go ahead. Why are you telling me this? You could have, whoever you are, whatever you have access to, you didn't have to come back down here. You didn't have to tell me about the HR system. You could have just handled it, whatever handling it means for someone like you. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, My mother worked overnight shifts in a hospital, not this one, a public hospital in Incheon a long time ago. Another pause, different from the others, heavier. She had a notebook too, different color, blue. Amara didn't say anything. She documented everything, the same way you did. Dates, times, names of witnesses who looked away. He said it flat, without inflection, like he had told this to no one and was not performing the telling now. Nobody looked at it. Not once, in 8 months, did anyone with the authority to look at it actually look at it. She said quietly, What happened to her? She died. He said it the way you say something that stopped hurting only because you ran out of ways to feel it. Exhaustion, officially. She worked double shifts because she needed the money, and she was afraid that if she complained loudly enough, they'd find a reason to let her go. He turned the statement over like he was checking its weight. She was right to be afraid. That part I cannot argue. Amara looked at him, really looked at him, in the stairwell light that was unkind to everyone, and she saw something she hadn't looked for before because she'd been too busy assessing threat level. She saw a man who was carrying something that had calcified over a long time into something harder than grief and softer than rage. She said, I'm sorry. He shook his head, not dismissing the sentiment, more like setting it aside to deal with later in a different space. Your wrist needs to be examined. It's a bruise. It may be a bruise. It should be confirmed. I'm not going to the hospital's medical staff. They report to, I know who they report to. I have a physician who works independently of this facility. He can be here within the hour. She looked at him. You have a private physician you can call at 2 a.m. I have several. No apology in that either. Just a man describing the specific shape of his life without dressing it up. And this physician, he won't report back to anyone at the hospital. He reports to me. That's not exactly reassuring. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, like the muscles remembered the shape of it. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. She thought about it for a moment. The bruise was real. The fact that Director Cho had been escalating, each incident incrementally worse than the last, each one calibrated, she was now convinced, against how much he believed he could get away with, was also real. The fact that she was in a stairwell at 2 a.m., talking to a man who owned the building through a chain of corporate entities, and had a private physician on call was real. Everything was real. That was the problem. None of this had any edges she could smooth down into something manageable. "Okay," she said. They moved to a small conference room on the 6th floor. Executive level, keycards that her badge would never have touched. A room that smelled like recycled air and expensive silence. Min Jai's associate, whose name was apparently Seo, and who communicated primarily through the careful economy of a man trained never to react visibly to anything, brought her tea without being asked, and positioned himself outside the door with the specific posture of someone who was both guard and ghost. The physician arrived in 53 minutes. She clocked it. His name was Dr. Lim. He was somewhere in his 50s, and he examined her wrist with the focused dispassion of someone who had long since learned to separate the medical fact from the human story attached to it. He said the bruise was deep tissue, no fracture, would peak in color around 48 hours. He said it in English directly to her, not to Min Jae, which she noted. After he left, Min Jae set a phone on the table between them. Not his personal phone. A separate one, basic, the kind that suggested function over everything else. "My legal counsel is available by call starting at 6 a.m., he said. "She speaks English. She will take your full statement, and she has no connection to this hospital's administrative structure." Legal counsel. "You have documented evidence of sustained workplace harassment, assault, deliberate suppression of formal complaints, and what appears to be coordinated administrative interference. You need representation. I'm a contract worker. My agency. Your agency will prioritize the contract over the contractor. That is what agencies do." He said it without cruelty, simply as a structural fact. "My counsel works outside that relationship. She'll represent your interests." Amara looked at the phone on the table. She thought about the notebook. She thought about the 87 days remaining on her contract and the 19 days until the restructuring that Director Cho had mentioned, like a man mentioning the weather. She thought about her sister Danielle, asleep right now on the other side of the world in a house that smelled like cedar and laundry detergent, who had told her to do something that scared her, something real, something that meant she'd actually lived. She thought about this fact that she was still sitting in this building instead of on a flight home, and she examined that thought honestly. The way she examined everything, and what she found underneath it, was not stubbornness or stupidity, but something closer to refusal. A specific cellular-level refusal to let the last 6 weeks be the final word on this. She picked up the phone. Min Jae stood. "I'll have Seo bring you something to eat. You should stay on this floor until morning." "You're not going to stay." "I have calls to make." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. She hadn't even noticed him take it off. "The people who manipulated your complaint records did not do it alone. Someone instructed them. I want to know who before 6 a.m. "And if you find out before 6? He looked at her. "Then the conversation with my lawyer will be significantly more productive." She said, "Kang Min Jae." He stopped. "You said you built something because of what happened to your mother, that if you ever had enough power—" She stopped herself because she realized she was repeating something back to him that he hadn't actually said tonight, that she had inferred from the 3 sentences he had offered, and the inference might be wrong. But he didn't correct her. He said, "Yes. This isn't just about financial irregularities." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell her everything she needed. "No," he said, "it's not." He left. The door closed. Seo remained outside it. Amara sat in the silence of the executive conference room with a phone she hadn't charged, and a bruise that was starting to color, and a notebook that was almost out of pages. And she did something she had not done once in 6 weeks. She let herself feel the full weight of how tired she was. Not the performing okay tired, not the documenting everything tired, but the deep structural exhaustion of a person who has been holding a building up with their bare hands for a very long time and has just been told they might be allowed to put it down. She did not put it down yet. She wasn't there yet. But she felt the possibility of it, and that was not nothing. By 4:15 a.m., Min Jae's world had changed shape. He stood in the anteroom adjacent to the conference floor, with his phone against his ear and his jacket back on, and the specific stillness of a man who has received a piece of information that reorganizes everything around it. The call he was on was with a man named Huang, not his legal counsel, not one of the investigators he'd dispatched, but a different category of contact entirely, a man who occupied the particular overlap between legitimate corporate intelligence and the kind of access that doesn't appear on any organizational chart. Huang had been inside the hospital's administrative data architecture for 40 minutes. The back-end access used to reclassify the second complaint, Minji said. Who logged it? The credential belongs to a senior IT administrator, Kim Jae-won, 12-year employee. A pause on the line. But the access pattern is wrong. Kim Jae-won's normal login behavior is consistent. Same hours, same access nodes, same duration. This action was logged at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when his keycard shows he left the building at 6:32 p.m. Proxied. Proxied. Someone used his credentials remotely. The origin IP is routed through the hospital's internal VPN, which means it came from inside on another machine, but the machine ID doesn't match any registered device in IT's own inventory. Minjae turned this over. A ghost machine. A ghost machine registered to a subnet that should only be accessible to executive administration. Huang let that sit for a moment. Specifically, to the office of the Chief Operating Officer. The name settled into the room. Chief Operating Officer, Park Dong-hyun, a man Minjae had met twice. Once at an acquisition meeting 3 years ago, once at a quarterly operational review that Minjae had attended specifically because the numbers coming out of the hospital's overnight department had been wrong in ways that were too consistent to be accidental. Park Dong-hyun had shaken his hand with both hands, the particular two-handed handshake of a man who wants you to feel trusted, and he had answered every question with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed the answers before the questions were asked. Minjae said, "Send me everything." "Already pushed to your secure channel." He hung up. He stood for a moment with his phone in his hand and the silence of the fourth-floor corridor at 4 a.m. around him, and the very specific feeling. He had felt it before, across different situations, in rooms that smelled like very different things, of a situation becoming irreversible. There was a point in every operation where the information you had accumulated reached a threshold, and past that threshold you were no longer making decisions about whether to act. You were making decisions about how. He had passed that threshold approximately 3 minutes ago. He pulled up CO's contact and typed a single message. "Conference room, now." SEO appeared at his shoulder in under 90 seconds, which was why CO was still employed. "Park Dong-hyun," Minjae said. "I need everything. Office communications, external calls, any digital correspondence that can be accessed without triggering a flag on his end. And I need it in a format that would hold in a Korean court." CO didn't ask questions. This was also why he was still employed. He said, "Timeline?" 6 a.m. "I want my counsel to have it when she takes the statement." CO nodded. Then, "The woman. She stays in the conference room. No one from hospital staff approaches that floor. If anyone asks why the executive level is restricted tonight, the answer is a security audit." "And if Cho Sung-hyun makes another approach?" Minjae looked at him. "Then the night becomes significantly more complicated for Director Cho." Seo took that exactly as it was meant and went. Minjae stood alone in the anteroom and thought about Park Dong-hyun's two-handed handshake. He thought about the ghost machine on the subnet. He thought about an IT administrator named Kim Jae-won, whose credentials had been borrowed while he was at home, and whether Kim knew, and if he didn't know, what that had cost him in terms of exposure. He thought about Amara Bennett in the conference room with a phone she hadn't charged, and a bruised wrist, and 87 pages of documentation that she had produced alone, in the dark, over 6 weeks, with no assurance that any of it would ever matter. He thought about his mother's blue notebook. He went back to making calls. At 5:40 a.m., Director Cho Sung-hyun arrived on the 4th floor for the start of his administrative shift and found that his keycard did not work. Not on the main corridor access. Not on the supply storage entry. Not on the department manager's office where he had worked for 4 years, where his coffee mug was still sitting on his desk with the corporate logo facing outward the way he always left it. The particular vanity of a man who believed his desk communicated something important about him. He tried the keycard 4 times. Then he stood in the corridor and looked at the access panel with the expression of a man who doesn't yet understand that his world has already changed irrevocably and is still operating on the assumption that this is a technical malfunction. He called the security desk. The overnight guard, Mr. Yoon, 19 years at Hansong Medical Tower, picked up and told him, in the careful tone of a man delivering a message he had been instructed to deliver verbatim, that Director Cho's access credentials had been suspended pending an administrative security review and that he should await further contact from the executive office. Cho said, "What security review? Who authorized this?" Mr. Yoon said, "I was told to direct any questions to the executive administrative office. I don't have additional information, Director Cho." Cho hung up. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he pulled out his personal phone and called Park Dong-hyun's direct line. The call went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail again. He typed a message. "My access has been suspended. What is happening? Call me immediately." He stared at the screen for 30 seconds. No reply. His next call was to a man whose name did not appear in any hospital directory, a contact he had maintained for 2 years as insurance. The kind of insurance that men like Cho accumulate not because they plan for things to go wrong, but because some part of them always knows that the structure they've built their comfort on is not as solid as it looks. The call connected on the second ring. The voice on the other end said, "I heard, don't call this number again." The line went dead. Cho stood in the empty fourth-floor corridor with his useless keycard in his hand and his phone going silent, and the first real cold feeling he had experienced in 4 years beginning to move through him. Not guilt, not yet, maybe never, but something that lived adjacent to it, that occupied the same temperature. The cold recognition of consequence, of a machine that had been running smoothly because he had greased it carefully and had now, without warning, without a single visible sign before this moment, seized. He thought about the foreign girl in her notebook. He thought about how impossible it was that a foreign girl with a composition notebook could have done this to him. He looked at the access panel one more time. The light was red. It had never been red for him before. He was still standing there when 2 men in dark jackets came around the corner from the elevator bay. Not hospital security, not administrators, but men with the particular deliberate pace of people who have already been told where they are going and do not need to hurry because they know you're not going anywhere either. One of them said, in Korean, "Director Cho, we've been asked to escort you to the executive conference room on the 6th floor. Cho looked at them. He looked at his phone. He looked at the red light on the access panel. "Who asked?" he said. The man said, "Mr. Kang." The second cold feeling hit deeper than the first. Because Director Cho Song-hyun, 4 years in this position, 2 years of careful insurance, a network of favors and suppressions, and a camera he had repositioned 11 days before a foreign girl noticed, knew that name. Everyone in a certain kind of soul knew that name. And knowing it meant knowing, with a clarity that landed like cold water, that the thing he had told Amara Bennett in that corridor 6 minutes before midnight, "You think anyone's coming for you? You think anyone in this building even knows your name?" had been the worst miscalculation he had ever made in his life. He put his keycard in his pocket. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the elevator with the 2 men, and his legs carried him there with the mechanical obedience of a body that already understands what the mind hasn't finished processing yet. In the executive conference room on the 6th floor, Amara Bennett was sitting with her notebook closed on the table in front of her, an untouched cup of tea gone cold beside it, watching the city outside the window begin its slow gray transition from night into something that was not yet morning but was no longer dark. She heard the elevator open down the corridor. She heard footsteps, 3 sets of them, the 2 measured and the one between them slightly uneven, slightly too fast, the walk of a man trying to hold himself together with posture. She recognized that walk. Not the sound of it, but the principle of it. She had used it herself for 6 weeks, every time she walked into a building that was supposed to be her workplace and was actually something else entirely. She looked down at her notebook. She looked at the last entry, the one she'd written in the stairwell. He crouched down. "He didn't stand over me." She turned to the next blank page. She wrote the date, the time, 5:58 a.m., and the location. Then she wrote, "He's here, in this building, on this floor, and this time the record doesn't disappear." She underlined the last 4 words. Outside the conference room, in the corridor that she couldn't see but could feel, the way you feel the approach of something that has been inevitable for a long time and is only now arriving at its proper moment, everything that had been set in motion in a stairwell at 2 a.m. was about to become something that no one in this building, not Director Cho, not Park Dong-hyun, not any man with a ghost machine on a restricted subnet, was going to be able to reclassify as a duplicate and send to an archive. The door to the executive conference room opened, and Amara did not flinch. The door opened, and it was not Director Cho. It was a woman. She was somewhere in her late 40s, wearing a gray blazer over a white shirt, carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it had been used seriously for a long time. Her hair was pulled back without fuss. She wore no jewelry except a watch. The practical kind, not decorative. She came through the door the way people come through doors when they have already decided what they are going to do on the other side of it. She said, in English that was cleaner and faster than Min Jae's, "Ms. Bennett, my name is attorney Yoon Ji-yeon. Mr. Kong retained me at 3 a.m. this morning. I'm here to take your statement." Amara looked at her, then at the door behind her, which had closed. "Where is Kong Min Jae?" "He's handling something on another floor." Yoon set her portfolio on the table and opened it. Instead, a legal pad, 2 pens, a digital recorder that she placed on the table between them with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had done this specific thing many times before. "He'll join us when he can. Right now, I need to hear everything, from the beginning. Don't summarize. I want specifics." Amara looked at the recorder. "Is that admissible? In Korea?" In Korean civil proceedings, recorded witness testimony taken by legal counsel is admissible as supporting evidence under Article 310 of the Civil Procedure Act, provided it is voluntarily given and properly documented. Yoon looked at her steadily. "I will document it properly. The voluntary part is yours." Amara put her hand on her notebook, felt the weight of it. Not heavy, physically. A composition book. Less than 200 pages, most of them filled. What it weighed was something that didn't have a unit. She said, "Start the recorder." She talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Yoon did not interrupt. She wrote constantly on the legal pad, and occasionally she said date or repeat that or the name of the second witness who looked away, not to steer the testimony, but to anchor it, to make sure every piece landed in its proper place within a structure that would survive scrutiny. Amara told it the way she had trained herself to document it, chronologically, precisely, without the editorializing that grief and anger and 6 weeks of accumulated exhaustion wanted to pull her toward. She told it like a woman reading a record that already existed, and her job was only to transmit it accurately. When she finished, the room was fully light. Seoul had come alive outside the windows without her noticing. Yoon stopped the recorder. She looked at her legal pad, dense, both sides of multiple sheets. Then she looked at Amara. "The notebook," she said. "I need to photograph every page." "It's my only copy. You'll keep it. I photograph, you retain the original. Chain of custody." Yoon pulled out her phone, a professional-grade camera function, the kind lawyers use for exactly this. "May I?" Amara slid it across the table. Yoon photographed every page, methodically, without rushing, making sure each frame was clear before moving to the next. She did not read as she photographed. She would read later, in a different room, with the specific attention that legal analysis requires. This part was only preservation. When she finished, she slid the notebook back. "Miss Bennett," she said, "what you've documented is not a workplace harassment case." Amara looked at her. "What is it?" "It is a criminal conspiracy. Sustained assault, deliberate evidence suppression, unauthorized manipulation of internal reporting systems, coordinated administrative interference, and what appears to be a pattern of institutionalized misconduct that predates your arrival by at minimum 2 years." She said it without drama, because she didn't need drama. The facts provided their own momentum. Director Cho is the instrument. He's not the architect. Park Dong-hyun. Yoon paused, just slightly. "You know that name." "Kang Min-jae mentioned a COO last night. He didn't use the name, but how much did he tell you?" "Enough to understand the shape of it." Yoon looked at her for a moment with the particular assessment of a lawyer recalibrating the person in front of her. Mr. Kang's investigation identified Park Dong-hyun's office as the source of the credential manipulation that buried your second complaint. What his investigation has also found, and what I need you to understand before we go any further, is that Park Dong-hyun is not the only executive involved. Amara was very still. "How many?" "We're still establishing the full scope." Yoon closed her portfolio. But the short answer is that the system designed to protect employees at this hospital was not merely inadequate. It was deliberately constructed to fail. The complaint routing, the HR access tiers, the overnight security protocols. They were built to create the appearance of due process while guaranteeing that any complaint originating from the overnight supply department would be neutralized before it reached anyone with actual authority to act. The room was quiet. Amara said, "They built a fake system. They built a functional system that performed suppression while appearing to perform protection." Yoon picked up her pen. "Your documentation didn't fail because you did anything wrong. It failed because the mechanism you submitted it to was designed to fail it." Amara had known this, had understood it at some level for weeks, in the bone-level way that you understand things you can't yet prove. But hearing it stated in the clean architecture of legal language did something different to it. It took the thing she had been carrying as a private, unverifiable suspicion and turned it into a fact that existed outside her body, in the world, where other people could see it. She picked up her notebook. She held it. "Tell me what happens next," she said. What happened next happened fast, and then it stopped, and the stopping was worse than the speed. By 9 a.m., Min-jae's investigative team had secured a copy of Director Cho's building keycard access log for the previous 8 weeks. Every entry, every exit, every door he had opened in this building, during every overnight shift in that period. They cross-referenced it against Amara's documentation. The overlap was not approximate, it was exact. Every incident she had recorded corresponded to a keycard entry in his log within minutes, sometimes within seconds. By 10 a.m., the digital forensics analyst Huang had traced the ghost machine on the COO's subnet to a specific device registered under a maintenance contractor's vendor account, a contractor whose company, when you followed the corporate structure 3 levels deep, shared a registered agent with a shell company that had made 3 payments to Director Cho's personal account over the past 14 months. By 11 a.m., Yoon had filed a formal complaint with the Korean Ministry of Employment and Labor's Special Investigation Unit, citing sustained workplace assault, criminal evidence suppression, and systemic institutional misconduct. She had attached Amara's photographed notebook, the HR access logs, the keycard data, and the forensic trace of the credential manipulation. By 11:23 a.m., the complaint had been acknowledged. By 11:51 a.m., it had been flagged for expedited review. By noon, it had been assigned to an investigator. By 12:08 p.m., that investigator had called Yoon's office directly and told her, in the careful language of a government official who understands what he is looking at, that the assigned investigator would need to recuse due to a conflict of interest. Yoon came back into the conference room with her phone in her hand and her face doing the thing that faces do when the information inside them is trying to stay professional, and the information is not making it easy. Amara saw her expression and felt the floor shift before a word was spoken. "What happened?" she said. It was not a question. "The investigator assigned to our complaint." Yoon set her phone on the table. On the screen was a directory listing from the ministry's staff registry. "His name is Investigator Baek Sung-joon. He joined the Special Investigation Unit 14 months ago. That's when the payments started to Director Cho's account." "Yes." Yoon's voice was level and precise. His prior employment before the ministry was with Park Dong-hyun's executive consulting firm, for 7 years. The silence that followed had a texture. It was not the silence of shock. Amara had burned through shock sometime around 4 a.m. But something more complicated and slower. The silence of a person who has just watched the road they were standing on disappear, not crumble, not break, but simply reveal that it was never load-bearing. "He was placed there," Amara said. "That is the most logical interpretation of the timeline, yes. Park Dong-hyun put someone inside the ministry's investigative unit 14 months ago, which means before your contract began, which means this was not reactive, but it was infrastructure." Yoon sat down. For the first time since she'd entered the room, she sat down like someone who needed to be sitting. Park Dong-hyun did not respond to the threat of investigation by placing someone in the ministry. He placed someone in the ministry as a preventative measure. He anticipated that complaints would eventually be generated and that some of them might escape the internal suppression system. This was the second layer. Amara looked at the notebook in her hands. She thought about 87 pages. She thought about 6 weeks of documentation that she had told herself was building something, a case, a foundation, a structure that would hold. She thought about the word infrastructure and what it meant when the person using it to describe the system opposing you was your own lawyer. She said, "Can we go around him?" The recusal is being processed. Another investigator will be assigned. But the recusal itself, the fact that it happened, the reason for it, will generate an internal review that will slow the assignment process. Yoon looked at her directly. "We're looking at days, possibly a week or more." He knows we filed. "The complaint is logged in the ministry system." "Yes. Anyone with access to that system, Park Dong-hyun has access. Or someone who reports to him does." Amara stood up. She didn't pace. She had never been a pacer. It felt like spending energy without purpose. But she stood because sitting had become a posture that no longer fit the shape of what she was feeling. She went to the window. Seoul was fully operational below her, all its ordinary daytime business proceeding with the total indifference of cities to the specific crises happening inside their buildings. She said, without turning around, "Last night, Director Cho told me that no one in this building knew my name." "Ms. Bennett, he was wrong about that. Kang Min-jae knew my name, or found it fast enough to matter, but Park Dong-hyun—" She stopped, turned. Park Dong-hyun built a system to make sure that even when someone like me had documentation, even when the documentation was real, and the timeline was right, and the evidence was clean, it went nowhere. He built a system that looked like justice and functioned like a wall. Yoon said, "Yes." "And he put someone inside the government to make sure even the thing outside the wall didn't work." "Yes." "So what do we actually have?" Yoon was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone avoiding the question, the silence of someone preparing to answer it honestly. "We have excellent evidence. We have documentation that would be compelling in any legitimate proceeding. What we may not have right now is a clear and unobstructed path to the proceeding itself." She paused. "What we need is for Mr. Kang to—" The door opened. Min-jae came in, and Amara knew immediately, from the set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness, which was different from his normal stillness, tighter, more contained, the stillness of someone managing something large, that he had already heard. He looked at Yoon first. "Baek Sung-jun." "Yes." "How long have you known?" 40 minutes. I was going to call you after. I found it 20 minutes ago from a different source." He set his phone on the table. On the screen was a photograph, a document, dense with text, financial figures. Park Dong-hyun has been moving money for the past 72 hours. Transfers to accounts in Singapore and one in Hong Kong, small enough individually to avoid automated flagging. In aggregate, approximately 1.4 billion won. The number landed in the room like something physical. Yoon said, "He's preparing to run." He became aware of our investigation sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. "I don't know how yet. I'm working on that." Amara said, "If he runs, he cannot take the institutional infrastructure with him. The shell companies, the vendor accounts, the suppression system. That evidence stays. But Park Dong-hyun himself, the man who built and directed it, the man whose testimony and physical presence would be central to any criminal prosecution." Min-jae looked at the table. He did not look at Amara. "If he crosses out of Korean jurisdiction in the next 24 to 48 hours, the prosecution timeline extends by years, maybe more." The room was very quiet. Amara said, "What do you need to stop him?" Min-jae looked at her then. Not the way he had looked at her in the stairwell. That careful, assessing look, the look of a man trying to understand what he was seeing. This was different. This was the look of a man who was making a decision about how honest to be. He said, "What I have the capacity to do and what is legally appropriate are not the same thing." "I know. I want to be clear about that. I understand what you're telling me." "Ms. Bennett," Yoon's voice cut in, sharp, professional. "I need to advise you clearly. Anything that falls outside legitimate legal—" "I know," Amara said again. Her voice was flat and steady. "I know the difference. I've been documenting the difference for 6 weeks." She looked at Min-jae. "What do you need?" He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Your testimony. The full statement you gave Yoon this morning. I need to submit it not to the ministry, but to an independent body. There is a joint oversight committee between the Korean Bar Association and the National Human Rights Commission that has independent investigative authority and is not subject to the ministry's assignment protocols. Why didn't we go there first? Because their mandate requires that internal channels be exhausted before they accept jurisdiction. The ministry filing, even a compromised one, is the documentation of exhausted internal channels. He looked at Yoon. It's enough? Yoon was already reaching for her portfolio. If I file within the hour and attach the evidence of the investigator conflict as proof of systemic compromise, they have grounds to accept immediate jurisdiction. She was writing as she spoke. It won't stop the ministry process, but it creates a parallel track that Park Dong-hyun's infrastructure does not cover. Then file. Yoon was already standing, already moving toward the door, already dialing. She left the room. The door swung behind her. Min-jae and Amara were alone in the conference room for the first time since the stairwell. He said, I should have moved faster. You moved in 18 minutes from a cold start at 2 a.m. I should have identified Baek Sung-jun's placement before we filed with the ministry. My team had access to the ministry's public staff registry. We should have cross-referenced. You had 8 hours. That should have been enough. He said it with a quiet, undemonstrative frustration. Not self-pity, not performance. Just a man holding himself to a standard he had set and acknowledging he had not met it. The money moving. If Park Dong-hyun was warned about our investigation last night, then someone in my operation communicated to his network. Someone I trust communicated to someone he trusts. And that chain exists somewhere, and I don't yet know where it is. Amara was very still. You have a leak. I have something I cannot yet identify that functions as one. His jaw was tight. There are 4 people who knew the full scope of tonight's investigation before 6 a.m. Hwang, Seo, my financial analyst, and Yoon. One of them, or someone connected to one of them, told Park Dong-hyun's network that we were moving. Could it be Yoon? He looked at her. She has represented me for 6 years. She has had access to things that would have been significantly more useful to my enemies than this. That's not a no. He paused. No, it's not. He said it like it cost him something. I don't believe it's her, but I cannot say with certainty, and in my experience, certainty is the first thing you sacrifice when you are trying to operate honestly. The morning light through the window was direct now, full, casting the conference table in a flat brightness that made everything look very exact and very exposed. Amara could see her own reflection faintly in the window's glass. She looked like someone who had been awake for a long time, which was accurate, and like someone who was not going to stop, which was also accurate. She said, Can I ask you something? Yes. Last night, when you came back to the stairwell in 18 minutes, you said you'd make calls. You came back in 18 minutes. She looked at him. Were you already in this building before you found me? The pause was brief, but it was there. Yes. Why? The anomalies in operational reporting I mentioned. I had been scheduled to review financial documentation on the executive floor starting at midnight. I do some of my most productive review work at hours when no one expects to find me in a building. You were working, alone, in the middle of the night. I prefer it. Because no one performs for you at 2 a.m. Something moved across his face. The almost smile again. Yes. She looked at him for a moment, then, the leak. If you don't find it before Yoon's filing goes through, Park Dong-hyun will know about the Joint Oversight Committee within hours of the filing. It becomes a public record at the point of acceptance. So you have a window. A small one. Then what are you doing in this room? He looked at her. She held the look. She was not being unkind, but they both understood that. She was being exactly what he had recognized in her from the first moment in the stairwell, which was a person who had no patience left for the space between understanding a problem and addressing it. He picked up his phone. He stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped, turned back. He said, "The notebook." He nodded at it. The composition book she still held, that she had been holding since Yoon returned it, that had not left her hands in the intervening hours. The diagram you drew of the repositioned camera. What about it? There is a second camera on the 4th floor that was not repositioned. It was simply turned off. Manually, at the circuit panel in the facility management room, on the same night that the other camera was moved. He said it looking at her directly. The facility management room is on the 4th floor. Its keycard log will show who accessed it on that date. She stared at him. You already have that log. I have it. It shows 2 entries that night. Director Cho. and Park Dong-hyun. The silence that followed was a different kind, not the silence of loss or obstruction, but the silence of something clicking into alignment, a piece that had been off-axis finally rotating into its correct position. Park Dong-hyun was physically present, she said. In this building, on that floor, on that specific night. He held her gaze. He didn't delegate the camera. He did it himself. She understood what that meant. She had documented enough, understood enough about the architecture of this corruption, to understand what it meant that a chief operating officer had come to the fourth floor of his own hospital in the middle of the night to manually disable a security camera. It meant he knew exactly what was going to happen in that space. It meant the camera was not turned off as a precaution. It was turned off as a permission. He greenlit it, she said. The words came out flat and cold and exact. He facilitated it directly. Min-jae's voice was the same temperature as hers. Which means the criminal exposure is not institutional misconduct. It is direct personal criminal liability. For assault facilitation. For a sitting executive officer. He paused. Which is why he's moving money to Singapore. Amara put the notebook on the table. She set both palms flat on the cover. She breathed, once, deliberately, the particular breath of someone deciding something. She said, "If he gets out of Korea, the case survives. But the man doesn't answer for it. Not for years. Not in any meaningful timeline. Your leak. I'm working on it." What if the leak finds out about the facility management keycard log before you find the leak? He had already thought of this. She could see it in the way he didn't pause. He had been sitting with this possibility and had not yet arrived at a clean answer. Then Park Dong-hyun destroys whatever can be destroyed and accelerates the departure. How quickly could he move? If he decided to move in the next 3 hours, he stopped himself, looked at the window. He could be at Incheon before Yoon's filing is accepted. 3 hours. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light made everything honest. She said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. "When I was on the 4th floor, before I went to the stairwell last night," she spoke carefully, "I saw Director Cho make a call. After he grabbed me. He was still in the corridor. I was moving away and I heard him. The call connected fast. The way calls connect when someone picks up immediately. The way calls connect to people who are expecting you." She picked the notebook back up, opened it to one of the early pages. "I didn't write down what he said because I couldn't hear it, but I wrote down the time. 1:49 a.m. Min-jae looked at the page, at the timestamp. "That call went somewhere," Amara said. 14 months ago, Park Dong-hyun placed someone inside the ministry. He built infrastructure. A man like that doesn't build infrastructure and then wait by his phone for a subordinate's report at 2 a.m., unless he already knew something was wrong in that building. Min-jae was very still. "Your people found the anomalies in operational reporting," she said. "The patterns that brought you to this building tonight. How long had those anomalies been detectable?" He said slowly. 3 weeks, approximately. Someone else could have detected them. Someone watching your investigation. Someone who told Park Dong-hyun that you were looking. She held the notebook. "Your leak didn't start tonight. It started 3 weeks ago. And Park Dong-hyun has been watching you watch him since before I ever handed you this notebook in a stairwell." The room was very quiet. Min-jae stood absolutely still with his phone in his hand and his eyes doing the fast, interior calculation of a man who has just understood that the ground he thought he was standing on has a different shape than he believed, and the shape is not in his favor, and the clock that he thought he had, 3 hours, a small window, a filing that might land in time, is already shorter than he calculated. He said one word, quiet, in Korean, and she didn't know the word, but she understood what it meant from the particular way it sat in his mouth. Not an expletive, not a prayer, but the sound a man makes when the full dimension of a mistake becomes visible all at once. Then his phone was already in his hand and he was already calling, and Amara was already opening her notebook to the next blank page, because there was going to be more to document, and the notebook still had a few pages left, and she was going to fill every single one. Min-jae made 3 calls in 4 minutes, and Amara listened to all of them. She didn't understand the Korean, but she understood the rhythm. The first call was short, almost curt, the tone of someone issuing an instruction that was not open to discussion. The second was longer, lower, and she heard a name repeated twice. Hwang. The third call was the one that made the air in the room change. because Min Jae's voice dropped to something she hadn't heard from him yet. A register below professional and below controlled, something that lived closer to the bone. He said 4 words in Korean and then listened for a long time without speaking, and when he hung up, his hand was very still around the phone. She said, "What?" He looked at her. "Seo." She didn't say anything. "Seo has worked for me for 9 years. He said it the way you say something that you are forcing yourself to say accurately rather than the way you want to say it. His younger brother has a debt, a significant one, to people who are connected to Park Dong-hyun's network through 2 intermediaries. He set the phone down on the table. "I didn't know about the debt. I should have known." "How long has he been passing information?" 3 weeks, consistent with the timeline you identified." He looked at the window. "He didn't know what he was doing to you specifically. He was reporting on my investigation patterns, not on individuals, but the result is the same." "Where is he now?" "Outside this door." He said it without inflection. "He's been outside this door for the past 4 hours. The reality of that landed in stages. The man who had brought her tea, who had positioned himself as guard and ghost, who had been physically between her and the corridor for the entire duration of the night, had been reporting to the network she was trying to dismantle. She had been sitting in a room feeling, for the first time in 6 weeks, like the door was being guarded on her behalf. She said, "Does he know you know?" "Not yet." "Then Park Dong-hyun doesn't know you know." Min Jae looked at her. The calculation moving behind his eyes was fast and visible only in the way his breathing shifted, barely, a fraction, as he arrived at the same place she was already standing. "No," he said, "not yet." She said, "How long to get to Incheon from here?" "By car. 40 minutes in current traffic. Park Dong-hyun's residence is in Seongbuk-gu, closer to the airport than this building. So if he decides to move in the next 2 hours, he's reachable, barely." She stood. "Then you need to use Seo." He looked at her. "One more communication, through Seo, to Park Dong-hyun's network. Something that tells him the investigation is stalled, that the ministry filing hit a wall and we don't have a secondary route." She held his gaze. "Buy us 2 hours." Min Jae was quiet for 4 full seconds. She counted them. Then he said, "That requires Seo to believe he's continuing to operate without my knowledge, which means I cannot confront him. I have to construct a conversation that he will overhear or participate in that contains the information I want passed." "Yes." "If he suspects I know, then Park Dong-hyun accelerates anyway, and we've lost nothing we didn't already lose." She picked up her notebook. "But if it works, 2 hours, he said. Maybe less. Park Dong-hyun is not a stupid man. You have a parallel filing going to the Joint Oversight Committee. What does that need?" He pulled out his phone again, opened something, read for a moment. "You needs one additional piece of documentation, the facility management keycard log, the one showing Park Dong-hyun physically present on the 4th floor. It's in my secure file channel, but it hasn't been transferred to her yet because I was going to do it in person." He looked up. "I was in this room." "Send it now." "If I send it through any channel Seo has visibility on, is there a channel he doesn't have visibility on?" A pause. "My personal encrypted line. He doesn't have the access key." He was already moving. "It takes 90 seconds to transfer. I need to step away from this floor." "Go." She was already moving toward the window, away from the door, putting her back to the wall the way she had put her back to the wall in the stairwell. Not from fear, not this time, but from the tactical instinct that had developed over 6 weeks of learning how to occupy a space safely. "I'll stay here." He moved to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle, turned back. "The conversation I need Seo to overhear," he said. "I need a reason to have it on this floor. A reason to speak about the investigation status out loud, near him." He looked at her. "I'm going to tell him you became uncooperative, that you're considering withdrawing the complaint." She blinked. "What?" "He needs to believe the operation is collapsing from the inside. The most believable version of that is that the victim, that you, broke under the pressure." He said it without flinching. "It's the version Park Dong-hyun would want to hear. It's the version Seo would believe most readily, because it fits what people like Park Dong-hyun expect people like you to do." She stood very still. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "You're asking me to be the weak point. I'm asking you to perform it, for approximately 4 minutes, in a hallway." He held her gaze. You've been performing strength for 6 weeks in a building that was trying to crush you. This is the same performance in reverse. She breathed, once, looked at the notebook, looked at him. 4 minutes, she said. 4 minutes. And then I send the file, Yoon files with the Joint Committee, and we move to intercept before Park Dong-hyun reaches any border. Intercept, she said. Define intercept. He said, legally. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't entirely believe that. I know, he said, but it's true. She didn't have the luxury of resolving that uncertainty right now, and they both understood that. And she picked up her notebook and followed him to the door. The hallway outside the conference room was not long. SEO was positioned near the elevator, standing, not leaning, the posture of someone who had been trained to remain ready without appearing to be. He turned when the door opened. His face was neutral in the practiced way of someone whose neutrality is professional. Min-jae walked out first, then Amara, close behind, and she made herself do the thing, made herself carry her body differently than she had been carrying it, let the exhaustion she had been managing show in her shoulders, let her face lose the particular set she had maintained all night. It wasn't hard. The exhaustion was real. She just stopped fighting it to the surface. Min-jae spoke in Korean. His tone was flat, tired, slightly frustrated. A man delivering bad news to himself more than to an audience. Seo listened, glanced at Amara, looked back at Min-jae. Then Min-jae turned to her and said, in English, loudly enough that anyone within 10 meters could hear the words without trying. Ms. Bennett, I need you to understand that if you withdraw the complaint now, there is nothing more I can do for you. She looked at the floor. She let her jaw work. She let 2 seconds pass before she said quietly, I can't do this anymore. You've already submitted the statement. You can't. I know what I submitted. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, and then she realized that was exactly right, that small was exactly the sound that Seo needed to hear and Park Dong-hyun needed to receive. I need to go home. I just want to go home. Min-jae said, in a tone that had the controlled exasperation of a man whose plan is failing. If you leave Korea, there's nothing left to fight with. She let her voice crack, just slightly, just enough. They have someone in the ministry. The file is going nowhere. I'm done. A beat. Then Min-jae said, quieter, almost to himself, I need to make another call. CO, stay with her. He walked away down the corridor, phone already to his ear, moving toward the stairwell access at the far end, out of earshot. Amara stood with her arms folded and her eyes on the floor. In her peripheral vision, Seo reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed something. The screen tilted away from her. She stared at the floor. She counted her own heartbeats. At 14, she heard the sound of a message sending. At 19, Seo put the phone away. 4 minutes. She had done it in under 3. Min-jae was already in the stairwell when his personal encrypted line finished transferring the keycard log to Yoon. He heard the confirmation tone and immediately called her. She picked up on the first ring. I have it. File now. Don't wait for me to confirm. File and call me when it's accepted. Min-jae, Yoon, now. A pause, then filing. He hung up. He stood in the stairwell, a different one, the western access, not the one where he had found Amara 4 hours ago. And for exactly 8 seconds, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the morning. The 9 years of Seo. The specific sound of a message sending in a quiet hallway. The face of a woman performing collapse, convincingly enough to be believed because the collapse was real, somewhere underneath, and she was choosing not to let it show, except when it served something. 8 seconds. Then he went back out. Park Dong-hyun received the message at 7:43 a.m. He was in his living room in Seongbuk-gu, dressed in a suit he had put on at 5 a.m. When the first alert came through, the particular suit of a man who dresses for contingencies even when he hopes they won't materialize. His travel bag was already packed, had been packed since 4 a.m. 2 bags, a carry-on with documents and a change of clothes, and a larger case that contained the specific physical objects, hard drives, a set of handwritten ledgers, 3 burner phones, that constituted his insurance policy against the people who had, over 14 years, helped him build and also implicitly threatened to dismantle the structure he had constructed at Hanseong Medical Tower. The message from his network contact read, Operation stalled, witness backing out, ministry file going cold, Kong's team fragmented. He read it twice. He looked at the travel bag. He looked at his watch, 7:44 a.m. He thought about the 1.4 billion won already moved to Singapore. He thought about the flight he had booked under a subsidiary company travel account that would not immediately flag his name. He thought about Baek Sung-joon inside the ministry, who had done his job and could continue doing his job if the situation restabilized. He thought about 14 years of careful construction, the complaint routing, the HR access tiers, the ghost machine, the camera on the fourth floor that he had turned off himself because he had not trusted Cho to be reliable enough to do it without error. And Cho had not been reliable, had escalated in ways that were drawing attention, which was why Park Dong-hyun had been awake since 3 a.m. when the first alert about Kong's presence in the building reached him. If the witness was backing out, if Kong's operation was fragmenting, he set the travel bag down. He picked up his phone and called his driver. Cancel the car. Then he called his contact at the subsidiary's travel account. Push the flight. I need 48 hours. He sat down. He looked at the window. The morning light in Seongbuk-gu was clean and ordinary, and he allowed himself to feel, for the first time since 3 a.m., the cautious loosening of a man who believes the worst may have passed. He was still sitting there at 8:19 a.m. when his front door opened. He had not heard a knock. He had not heard a key. He heard the door, and he turned, and standing in the entrance of his living room were two men he did not recognize, and one man he did. The man he recognized was not Min Jae, not anyone from the Kong organization, but an officer from the Korean National Police Agency's Financial Crimes Investigation Unit, whose name Park Dong-hyun knew because Park Dong-hyun made it his business to know the names of people in positions that were relevant to his own continued freedom. The officer's name was Detective Inspector Lim Chae-won. He had been with the Financial Crimes Unit for 11 years, and he had specifically not been placed there by Park Dong-hyun, which was the reason Min Jae's legal counsel had at 6:18 a.m. delivered a sealed evidence package directly to Detective Inspector Lim's personal office address rather than to the unit's general intake. Lim held up his identification. He said, Park Dong-hyun, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of facilitation of assault, criminal suppression of evidence, unauthorized access to government investigative systems, and financial crimes including fraudulent transfer of corporate assets. He paused. You have the right to remain silent. Park Dong-hyun looked at the travel bag. He looked at the warrant in Lim's hand. He said very quietly, Who? Lim said, Sir, I'd like you to stand. Park Dong-hyun stood. His legs did it without consulting the rest of him. He stood the way Cho had walked to the elevator, with the mechanical obedience of a body that has already processed what the mind is still rejecting. He thought about the message, Operation stalled, witness backing out. He thought about Kong Min Jae, who had been in that building at 2 a.m., and who had, in the span of 6 hours, done what 14 years of careful construction was supposed to make impossible. He said, The message, Sir. Lim's voice was patient and final. Please come with us. Amara's phone rang at 8:23 a.m. She was still in the conference room. She had been writing. The notebook was almost out of pages, 2 left, maybe 3 if she kept her handwriting tight. And she had been filling them with the morning's events in the same precise, chronological style that had carried her through 6 weeks, because the habit was structural now. It was load-bearing, and she didn't know yet how to put it down even when the emergency was resolving. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She answered. A woman's voice, not Yoon, someone else, official sounding, reading from something. Ms. Amara Bennett? This is the office of the Korean National Human Rights Commission. We are calling to notify you that your complaint, filed this morning by attorney Yoon Ji-yeon, has been accepted for expedited review under the Commission's Emergency Jurisdiction Protocol. A case coordinator will be in contact within... She stopped listening at accepted. She sat with the phone against her ear and the woman's voice continuing, and the notebook open in her lap, and the bruise on her wrist in full color now. Purple and green at the edges, darkest at the center where the pressure had been concentrated. And she thought about the specific words Director Cho had said in the corridor at 1:49 a.m. You think anyone's coming for you. She pressed her palm flat against the open page of the notebook. The door opened. Min-jae came in. He looked at her face, whatever was on it, because she wasn't managing it at this particular moment. She was letting it exist without management for the first time in 6 weeks. And he stopped in the doorway. She said into the phone, "Thank you. Yes, I'll be available." She hung up. She looked at him. He said, "Park Dong-hyun is in custody." She breathed. "Cho will be formally arrested within the hour. The warrant was issued 20 minutes ago." He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood across the table from her with his hands at his sides and his face doing something that she recognized because she had felt the same thing, somewhere underneath the exhaustion. Not relief, not exactly, but the specific physiological response of tension that has been held for a very long time beginning, finally, to release its grip. Yoon's filing with the Joint Committee was accepted at 7:58 a.m. The facility management keycard log placing Park Dong-hyun physically on the 4th floor has been transmitted to both the committee and Detective Inspector Lim's unit at the National Police Agency. "CO," she said. "CO is no longer with my organization." He said it without elaboration. "His debt will be addressed through other means. He'll have options." She nodded. She didn't ask what the options were. She had decided at some point in the past hour that there were layers of Min-jae's world she was going to accept as existing without requiring a complete map of them, at least for now. She looked at the notebook, at her palm pressed against the page. She said, "I need to call my sister." He said, "Yes, you should. She's going to want to fly here." "Is that a problem?" Amara thought about it. About Danielle on a plane, maxing out a credit card she couldn't afford, arriving at Incheon Airport furious and helpless and loud and entirely, completely herself. "No," she said. "Actually, no, I think it would be fine." Something in Min-jae's face changed. Not the almost smile this time. Something that went deeper than that, quieter, less guarded. The face of a man who has not, in a long time, been in a room where someone said it would be fine and meant it without performing it. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was direct and unforgiving, and she was exhausted, and the bruise on her wrist was at its worst color, and the notebook had 2 pages left, and none of that, for this particular moment, felt like the most important thing in the room. She said, "You said your mother had a blue notebook." "Yes." "What happened to it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I kept it." He said it simply, as if this required no elaboration, and she understood from the way he said it that it required none. She looked at the composition book in her lap, the black and white marbled cover, the pages she had filled and the few she hadn't. She said, "What do we do now?" He looked at her, not calculating, not assessing, not the eyes of a man who processes information faster than he reveals it. Just looking, with the particular attention of someone who is, for once, not sure of the answer, and has decided that not being sure is acceptable. He said, "I don't know. I've never done this part before." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Neither have I." Outside the windows of the 6th floor conference room, Seoul moved through its morning with the total indifference of a city to the specific resolution of the specific crises that occur daily within its buildings. Traffic on the elevated highway, a delivery truck making a turn, a woman walking with coffee, ordinary things proceeding in the ordinary light, and somewhere below all of it, in the records that would outlast this morning, in the files that would become evidence and testimony and precedent, the 89 pages of a composition book with a black and white marbled cover were doing what they had always been designed to do, holding the exact shape of the truth, precisely, without apology, waiting for the moment when someone with the authority to act finally looked. That moment had arrived. And in the conference room on the 6th floor, a woman who had been invisible for 6 weeks sat in the full light of morning and did not hide. And the feared man across the table from her did not look away. And between them on the table sat a notebook that still had 2 pages left. She picked up her pen. She was not done yet. She called Danielle at 8:31 a.m., Seoul time, which made it 7:31 p.m., the previous evening in Baltimore, which meant Danielle was probably sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and the particular posture of a woman who had been waiting for this call without knowing she was waiting for it. Danielle picked up on the second ring and said, "Tell me you're okay." Not hello, not how are you. Just that, direct and without preamble, the specific frequency of a sister who has been monitoring a low-grade unnameable worry for weeks without being told why. Amara said, "I'm okay." A pause. Then, "You don't sound okay." "I'm okay. It's been a long night." She stopped, started again. "Something happened. A lot of things happened. I'm safe. I need you to know that first. I'm safe. But I need to tell you some things that are going to make you want to get on a plane." Danielle said, "Already Googling flights." "Danielle, tell me. I'll book while you talk." So Amara told her. Not the documentation version, not the precise, chronological, legally formatted account she had given Yoon in the conference room. The other version, the one with her own fear in it, the one with the specific texture of 6 weeks of walking into a building where she did not feel safe, and doing it anyway because she had nowhere else to go and no mechanism that functioned, and a notebook she had been filling because filling it was the only form of agency available to her. She told it sitting in the chair by the window of the executive conference room, and Min-jae had left when she started dialing, had quietly picked up his jacket and stepped out without being asked, because he understood without explanation that this was not a conversation that required an audience. She told Danielle about Director Cho. She told her about the HR portal. She told her about Mr. Yoon at the security desk and Korean workplace culture and the camera that had been repositioned 11 days before she noticed it. She told her about the stairwell at 2 a.m. When she got to Min-jae, Danielle said, "Wait, the man who owns the hospital, he found you in the stairwell at 2 in the morning." "Yes." "And what is he exactly?" Amara thought about how to answer that. She thought about Seo and about the 2 men who had come through Park Dong-hyun's front door, and about the particular way Min-jae's voice had dropped in his third phone call, the register below professional, and about the fact that he had answered her question about interception with the word legally in a tone that she had not entirely believed. She said, "He's complicated." "Complicated how?" "Complicated in ways that I'll explain when you're here. I'm booking the flight right now." "Danielle, Amara." Her sister's voice shifted. Not harder, but denser, weighted with the particular gravity of someone who loves you specifically enough to be afraid for you. "You've been carrying this alone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. You are my sister, and you were being hurt, and you didn't tell me." She didn't answer immediately, because the answer was complicated too, and she was tired, and the bruise on her wrist was at its full color, and somewhere below in the building. Director Cho was probably already in custody, and Park Dong-hyun was already in a police vehicle, and the machine that had been built to make her invisible was already being dismantled piece by piece, and none of that changed the 6 weeks. None of it reached back and undid them. She said, "I know." "Why didn't you call me?" "Because I didn't want you to come here and be helpless on my behalf." A long pause. Then Danielle said quietly, "I would have come anyway." "I know. That's not something you get to protect me from." "I know." Another pause, softer now. "How bad is the bruise?" Amara looked at her wrist. "It's pretty bad." "Are you getting it looked at?" "Already did. A doctor came. It's a bruise, no fracture." "A doctor came to the conference room at—" Danielle stopped. "You know what? Never mind. I'm not going to try to understand the logistics of this right now. I'm booking the 10:45 p.m. flight. I land in Seoul at—" the sound of typing, 6:20 a.m. day after tomorrow. "You don't have to—" "Amara." "Okay. Tell me one more thing." "What?" "Are you actually okay? Not safe?" "Okay." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything anymore. She thought about the notebook and the last 2 pages and the pen she was still holding. She thought about the almost smile that lived at the edge of Min-jae's face. She thought about the fact that for the first time in 6 weeks, she had sat in a room and not assessed every possible exit. "I think I might be," she said. "Eventually. I think I might actually be." The formal proceedings against Director Cho Sang-hyun and Park Dong-hyun moved through the Korean legal system with the particular momentum of cases that carry an abundance of documented evidence and a scarcity of viable defense. Cho was arrested at 9:14 a.m. Not in the building, which he had already been escorted from, but at a cafe 2 blocks away where he had apparently been sitting with his phone for the better part of an hour, calling numbers that did not answer and drinking coffee that had gone cold. The arresting officers found him staring at the table. He did not resist. He did not say anything when they identified themselves or when they read the charges. He looked at the cold coffee. He looked at his phone. He stood when they asked him to stand. Amara was not there for the arrest. She learned about it from Yoon, who called at 9:22 a.m. with the controlled efficiency of a lawyer delivering information that is both professionally significant and personally not without weight. Cho is in custody, Yoon said. Park Dong-hyun was processed at 8:47 a.m. The warrants were issued on 5 charges. I'll send you the full list. But the primary charge that will carry the most weight in prosecution is the facilitation count, because the keycard evidence places Park Dong-hyun on that floor personally, and his defense counsel is going to have a genuinely difficult time constructing an innocent explanation for why the chief operating officer was manually disabling a security camera at 11:30 p.m. on a floor he had no operational reason to be on. Amara said, "What about Baek Sung-jun, the investigator inside the ministry?" The National Human Rights Commission submitted a formal referral to the ministry's Internal Affairs Division at 8:05 a.m. Baek Sung-jun has been placed on administrative suspension pending investigation. A pause. His cooperation is being negotiated. His lawyers called before 9 a.m. He's going to cooperate. His lawyers believe it's his best option, given the depth of the documented connection to Park Dong-hyun's network. Yes. Yoon's voice carried the particular dry precision of someone who has spent enough time in legal proceedings to have no illusions about why people cooperate and no judgment about it either. Cooperation from Baek Sung-jun will accelerate the prosecution timeline significantly. It also means the network's financial structure, the shell companies, the vendor accounts, gets mapped through his testimony. That's the piece that turns this from a workplace misconduct case into an organized criminal conspiracy case. Which is what it was. Which is what it was, Yoon agreed, and which is what it will now be called, on record, in a Korean court, with your documentation as the foundation of the evidentiary structure. Amara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the 2 remaining pages in the notebook. The other employees, she said, the ones who, I know there were others, on the overnight supply floor. I saw things, during those 6 weeks. I documented some of it, but I didn't have direct testimony. I only had what I witnessed. The investigation will reach them, Yoon said. With Cho in custody and Park Dong-hyun's network exposed, the institutional pressure that kept people silent is gone. The Commission's investigators will conduct outreach to all overnight staff on the 4th and 5th floors going back 24 months. A pause. You open the door, Ms. Bennett. Other people will walk through it. She held the phone and breathed. One more thing, Yoon said. Your contract, the agency, they've already sent an email about the restructuring. I know. I drafted a response on your behalf that I'd like to send them this morning. It informs them that any restructuring affecting your position, while formal legal proceedings are active, constitutes retaliatory action under Korean labor protection statutes and will be treated accordingly. Yoon paused again. The email has a different quality than the ones their legal department is accustomed to receiving. Send it, Amara said. Already did, said Yoon. I sent it at 8:55. I was going to tell you. For the first time in 6 weeks, Amara felt something pull at the corner of her mouth that was not practiced or performed. She pressed her fingers against her lips for a moment, held it there. Thank you, she said. Ms. Bennett. Yoon's voice shifted, just slightly, the way voices shift when the professional layer thins enough to let something through. What you did, what you produced, the documentation you maintained alone, over 6 weeks, in a building designed to bury exactly this kind of evidence, it is genuinely exceptional work. I have practiced law for 21 years. I have seen a great many witness testimonies and a great many evidentiary records. A pause. Yours is among the most disciplined I have ever reviewed. Amara didn't say anything for a moment. The light through the conference room window was at the angle that made everything look very clean and very exact. She looked at her hands. She said, I was just writing things down. Yes, said Yoon. That's what made it exceptional. But Minji came back at 10 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee from somewhere that was not the hospital cafeteria. So, real coffee, the kind that had been made by someone who understood what they were doing, in a paper cup that had already left a faint ring on whatever surface it had briefly rested on. He set one on the table in front of her without ceremony, without asking whether she wanted it. in the particular way of someone who has been paying enough attention to understand that asking is unnecessary. She wrapped both hands around the cup. He sat down across from her. He looked tired in a way that his stillness usually concealed but did not fully conceal now. There was a quality to the set of his eyes that comes from a long night and a longer morning and the specific kind of exhaustion that is not physical. She said, "Seo." He looked at the table. "I sent him to his brother's. I told him the debt is cleared. The debt is cleared." "You paid it. I arranged for it to be resolved." He said it without expansion, even after. "The debt is what they used," he said. "If I remove the debt, I remove the mechanism." He looked up. His brother is not involved in any of this. He's 23, and he made a bad decision about money 2 years ago. I'm not going to leave a 23-year-old inside a debt structure that gets people used. A pause. That's not something I'm willing to do. She looked at him, at the particular stubbornness of his face when he said things he'd already decided. She thought about his mother, who had worked overnight shifts and kept a blue notebook, and had died without anyone with enough power choosing to look at it. She thought about the specific chain of events that turned a person into someone who would arrange for a 23-year-old's debt to be cleared because the mechanism needed to be removed. She said, "What happens to the hospital now?" He picked up his coffee, held it without drinking. "The board will convene an emergency session this week. Several executive positions will become vacant as the investigation scope becomes clear. The overnight staffing structure, the isolation protocols that kept workers on the 4th floor with minimal visibility, those are being restructured immediately." He looked at the window. "I should have done it 2 years ago." "You didn't know." "I should have known." He said it the same way he'd said it earlier. Not self-flagellation, not performance of guilt, just a man applying a consistent standard to himself. The anomalies in the operational reporting, the patterns that brought me here, they were detectable 2 years ago if I had been looking. I was looking at the financials. I was not looking at the people. You looked at me. I found you in a stairwell. You could have walked past. He looked at her then. The tiredness and the honesty of the look were the same thing. "No," he said. "I couldn't." She held her coffee. Outside, Seoul was fully into its morning, the particular relentless productivity of a city that doesn't stop for anything. She thought about the fact that she had been in this building for more than 8 hours now. She thought about her apartment in Mapogu, the small one, the one that had felt temporary and provisional from the first day because she had been living inside the mentality of someone who might have to leave at any moment. She thought about the pharmacy near her building where she had bought the notebook. She said, "I need to sleep." "Yes. I can't sleep in this building." "I know. CO's car is—" He stopped, corrected. "There is a car available to take you wherever you need to go." "My apartment." "Of course." She stood. She picked up the notebook. She put it in her bag, the same bag she had been carrying every night to the 4th floor, the one with the extra pen and the laminated copy of her contract, and the building keycard that no longer felt like her primary means of accessing the building's power structures. She looked at him. He stood. They looked at each other across the conference room table in the full morning light, and she thought about what it meant that less than 9 hours ago she had been sitting on a stairwell landing between floors 4 and 5 with a bruise building on her wrist and a notebook she was using as a shield, and this man had crouched down to her level and not stood over her, and that had been that one small physical gesture, the deliberate choice to not take up the space that his power would have allowed him. That had been the thing. Not the investigation, not the lawyers or the files or the forensics, the crouch, the level eyes. She said, "The blue notebook. Your mother's." "Yes." "You kept it." "Yes." "All this time." "All this time." She said, "I think you built something she would have wanted to exist. The oversight, the restructuring. I think she'd have wanted to know that her notebook meant someone built this." He was very still. Whatever moved through his face in that moment was not for her to name. It was private in the way that some things are private even when they happen in full view of another person, because they happen in the internal space that doesn't have adequate external translation. He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He breathed. He said, "Thank you." She nodded. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the handle when he said her name. Not Ms. Bennett, not the formal distance of the morning's proceedings. Her name. Amara. She turned. He said, "The cafe on Yanguaro, near the bridge. It opens at 6 in the morning. The coffee it's very good." He said it with the particular care of someone choosing their words for a specific reason. "I go sometimes, before everything starts." She looked at him. "The view of the river is better before the traffic builds," he said. And then, because he was not a man who performed things he didn't mean, "I thought you might want to know that." She held his gaze for a moment. She was tired and she had 2 pages left in her notebook, and her sister was going to land at Incheon in 36 hours, and there was a prosecution to navigate and a restructuring at the hospital and a contract agency email to follow up on, and approximately 40 things that needed her attention in the next week. She said, "What time?" "I'm usually there by 6:30. She opened the door. She said, "I'll think about it." She walked out. The door closed behind her. In the corridor, she passed the place where Seo had stood for 4 hours guarding a room while reporting to the people on the other side of it, and she kept walking, and the elevator came when she called it, and she went down. Well, Danielle arrived on a Tuesday, 2 days after the arrests, pulling a suitcase that was too big for a short trip, and wearing the expression of a woman who has been managing anxiety at altitude for 14 hours and is not going to pretend otherwise. She came through the arrivals gate and found Amara waiting with both hands in her jacket pockets. No sign, no performance, just standing there. And Danielle covered the distance between them in about 4 steps and put her arms around her sister with a force that was entirely uncalculated. Amara stood in it. She let herself be held. She did not manage it or document it or assess it for structural integrity. She just stood in the arrivals hall of Incheon International Airport, in the noise and the fluorescent light, and the particular controlled chaos of a major transit hub, and let her older sister hold her for a long time. Danielle said, into her shoulder, "I'm so mad at you." "I know." 6 weeks. "I know. If anything like this ever, I'll call." Danielle pulled back. She looked at her, at the bruise on her wrist, which was fading now, yellow at the edges where the purple was retreating, still dark at the center. She touched it very lightly with 2 fingers, not examining it, just acknowledging it, the specific way that people who love each other acknowledge the physical evidence of what the other has survived. She said, "Tell me everything, the whole thing, don't spare me." So Amara told it again. The real version, the full version, the version that included the fear and the exhaustion, and the night she had sat on the 4th floor after her shift ended, and written in the notebook, because going home to the apartment meant confronting the silence of a space that had stopped feeling like refuge, and she needed to feel like she was still doing something, still building something, still maintaining some form of agency over the shape of her own situation. She told it all the way through to the stairwell and Min Jae and Yoon and Seo and Park Dong-hyun's living room and the 2 men coming through a door that she had not heard open. When she got to the cafe on Yanghwa-ro, Danielle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Mafia boss who owns the hospital. He prefers businessman." "I'm sure he does." Danielle looked at her. "You're going, aren't you, to the cafe?" Amara didn't answer immediately. "Amara, I haven't decided. You've decided. I said I'd think about it." "Which means you've decided." Danielle leaned back in the taxi seat. They were moving through Seoul now, the highway from Incheon lined on both sides with the evidence of a city that has expanded faster than any single decade could fully contain. "What is he like?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the crouch, the 18 minutes, the 9 years of Seo, and the decision to clear the debt anyway. The specific sound of his voice when he'd said she had a notebook too, different color, blue. He's someone who's been running at the same speed for a very long time and doesn't know how to stop. That's what he is. What is he like? She looked out the window. "Honest," she said eventually, in ways that cost him something. Danielle looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." "Okay?" "I'm not saying it's simple, I'm saying okay." Danielle looked out her own window. "You can tell me the rest when you figure out what the rest is." 3 weeks after the arrests, the Korean National Human Rights Commission published its preliminary findings in the case of Hanseong Medical Tower, a 47-page document that outlined the systematic suppression structure, the coordinated evidence manipulation, and the deliberate construction of complaint mechanisms designed to fail the people who used them. The document identified 19 former and current employees across 3 departments who had submitted complaints that were buried, rerouted, or reclassified over a 26-month period. 11 of those employees had left the hospital, some voluntarily, some through manufactured redundancies that the report characterized as constructive dismissal. 3 had signed non-disclosure agreements in exchange for departure packages that the report noted were now legally void under the circumstances of their procurement. Amara was not named in the public report. She had requested anonymity in the proceedings, and Yoon had made sure it held. Her notebook was cited in the evidentiary appendix as Document A, Primary Complainant Record. The citation noted its contents, 89 entries spanning 41 days, cross-referenced against digital timestamps, keycard access logs, and security footage recovered from a camera that had been manually disabled and subsequently restored during the investigation. The citation noted that every hand-recorded entry in Document A was independently corroborated, every entry, every single one. She read the citation in her apartment in Mapogu, sitting at the small kitchen table with the report open on her laptop and the notebook beside it, and a cup of tea she had made for herself and forgotten to drink. She read it twice. She read the specific language, independently corroborated, and she felt something that she did not immediately have a name for, a pressure in the chest that was not grief and not relief, but something that occupied the space between them, something that had to do with the specific experience of being told that the thing you knew was true has been confirmed to be true by a mechanism that exists outside your own body and your own memory and your own desperate, careful record keeping. She opened the notebook to the last pages. The 2 she had not yet used. She wrote the date. She wrote the citation. She wrote, every entry independently corroborated. She held the pen over the page for a moment. Then she wrote, I was right. I was right the whole time. She looked at those words for a long time. They were not graceful. They were not documented in the way that documented things are documented. They were just true, written plainly, in her own handwriting, in the notebook that had started as survival and ended as foundation. She closed it. She put it on the shelf. Director Cho Song-hyun was convicted 7 months later on 4 counts: aggravated assault, criminal harassment, conspiracy to suppress evidence, and willful negligence in the execution of supervisory duty. His sentence was 3 years and 8 months in a correctional facility in Gyeonggi Province. His lawyers had argued mitigating circumstances related to institutional culture and managerial pressure from above. The court had found the argument unpersuasive given the physical evidence, the recovered footage, and the testimony of 6 additional employees who came forward after the Commission's preliminary report made the institutional protection structure visible and therefore survivable to challenge. He did not look at Amara during sentencing. She did not require him to. Park Dong-hyun's trial took longer, the way trials involving financial complexity always take longer. 11 months, 2 defense teams, a motion for venue change that was denied, and a separate civil proceeding running parallel to the criminal prosecution that pulled in the shell companies, the vendor accounts, and the subsidiary that had booked his flight. His conviction came on 6 counts, including facilitation of criminal assault, organized evidence suppression, unauthorized access to government investigative systems, and criminal financial fraud. The sentence was 9 years, later reduced to 7 on appeal, later reduced again to 6 on the basis of Baek Sung-jun's cooperative testimony, which had been extensive enough to warrant the reduction in prosecutorial sentencing recommendations. 6 years. Amara had thought about what 6 years meant. She had thought about the 19 employees whose complaints had been buried, and the 11 who had left, and the 3 who had signed documents they had been told were their only option. She had thought about what 6 years cost, and what 6 years returned, and had arrived at the conclusion that the number was imperfect, and that imperfect was not the same as inadequate, and that the system that produced the number was the same system that had produced Document A's independent corroboration, and she was living inside that system and working with what it offered, rather than burning herself up against what it lacked. She had talked to Min-jae about this, not the day of the sentencing. They had not seen each other that day, and she had needed the day to be her own. But the following week, at the cafe on Yanghwa-ro, she had gone to the cafe for the first time on a Thursday morning, 10 days after the hospital, at 6:22 a.m. She had not told him she was coming. She had not told herself she was going until she was on the bus. She had walked in and found him at a corner table with a view of the Han River and a cup of coffee, and the particular expression of someone who is using early morning and quiet, and the company of water, to do something that doesn't have an adequate word. He had looked up. He had seen her. His expression had not changed exactly. It was more that it had settled, the way a room settles when the last piece of furniture finds its correct position. He had said, "The coffee here is better than the hospital." She had sat down. She had ordered. They had watched the river for a while without talking, and the not talking had been easy in the specific way that things are easy when the effort of maintaining them is low. When the silence between two people does not require management, does not need to be filled, does not carry the weight of performance. She had come back the following Thursday, and the one after that. They did not talk about the investigation in those mornings. They talked about other things, about Baltimore, about Incheon, about the specific way cities smell in the early morning before the exhaust and commerce overlay everything. She told him about her mother's garden on her parents' house in Baltimore, the way her mother grew tomatoes in containers on the back porch and talked to them like they were capable of hearing discouragement. He told her about the specific summer when he was 12, and his mother had taken him to see the ocean for the first time, and he had not understood until that moment that there were things in the world larger than the problem you were currently inside. He told her that slowly, in pieces, over several weeks, not as a performance of intimacy, as the natural, gradual process of one person becoming visible to another. She did the same. It was not uncomplicated. She was clear-eyed enough to understand that she was building something with a man who moved through a world whose edges were not fully illuminated, who had made decisions she would not have made and would not make, who carried the specific weight of someone who had built power from grief and had not fully finished reckoning with what that process had cost him. She was clear-eyed enough to understand that being clear-eyed about something is not the same as being simple about it. She was also clear-eyed enough to understand that he had crouched down in a stairwell and looked at her level and handed her notebook back with both hands, and that those were not small things, and that a person who does those things in those circumstances is telling you something true about themselves that is worth the complication of the rest. Danielle came to Seoul twice in the following year. The first time she met Min-jae, she shook his hand with the particular grip of a woman who is communicating multiple messages simultaneously through physical contact, and he received it without flinching and said something that made her look at him differently. And afterwards she told Amara, "I still think this is complicated." And Amara said, "I know." And Danielle said, "Okay, good, as long as you know." On the first anniversary of the night in the stairwell, Amara walked into Hanseong Medical Tower through the main entrance in the late afternoon and took the elevator to the fourth floor. The fourth floor was different. The overnight staffing had been restructured, expanded, paired, scheduled with an overlap system that meant no worker on any overnight shift was isolated on that floor or any other. The supply storage area had been reorganized and the camera above it, the one she had diagrammed, the one she had measured against her supply cart, had been replaced with two cameras correctly positioned on a system that archived to an independent server rather than the hospital's internal network. The facility management room where Park Dong-hyun had turned off the other camera was now controlled by a security protocol that required dual authorization and logged every entry in real time to an external monitoring company. She walked the corridor. She was not afraid. That was the fact she was most interested in. Not triumphant, not nostalgic, not performatively resolved, just not afraid. The building was a building. The corridor was a corridor. She had worked here and something terrible had happened here, and something consequential had followed, and the place was now, demonstrably, different than it had been. And she was still here, and the man who had done what he'd done in this corridor was in a correctional facility in Gyeonggi Province. And none of that was simple or clean, but all of it was real. She went to the stairwell, the eastern access. She pushed through the door and stood on the landing between the fourth and fifth floors where she had pressed herself against a concrete wall on a night 9 months ago with a notebook held against her chest, like it was the only solid thing left. She looked at the wall, at the landing, at the fluorescent light above her, which hummed at the same frequency, which would always hum at the same frequency, because fluorescent lights do not adjust their pitch to the emotional register of the people who stand beneath them. She stood there for a while. Not long. Long enough. Then she went back through the door and into the corridor and took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out through the main entrance into a Seoul evening that was cold and alive and full of ordinary people moving through ordinary lives, and she turned left toward the bus stop and pulled her jacket collar up against the wind. Her phone buzzed. Min-jae. A message, not a call. He had learned that she preferred messages when she was thinking, that calls interrupted the interior work she was usually doing. The message said, "The cafe opens at 6, in case you wanted to remember." She looked at the message for a moment. The cold moved through her jacket collar, and she let it, because it was honest weather, doing what weather does, and she was standing in it. She typed back, "I remember." She put her phone in her pocket. She started walking toward the bus stop. She passed a pharmacy. Not her pharmacy. A different one. Larger, lit from inside with the particular brightness of places that stay open late for practical reasons. And she looked in at the rack near the entrance where the composition books sat in a stack, the kind with the black and white marbled covers, the kind that cost almost nothing. She kept walking. She did not need one. The notebook was on her shelf at home, closed, beside the one Min-jae had left in her locker before she found out what he'd left. The blue one. The one with only 4 words written inside it in handwriting. That was careful and slightly formal, in the way writing is when someone composes it, the way they compose things that matter. "You'll never need this." She had read that sentence many times in the months since. She had turned it over the way you turn over something that was meant with sincerity and landed with more dimension than the writer might have intended. She had decided, eventually, that the sentence was not a promise about the future. Nobody could make that promise, and Min-jae was not a man who made promises he couldn't anchor. It was something else. It was an expression of intent, a statement of what he was choosing to build and why and for whom. She understood that. She had her own version of it. The bus came. She got on. She found a seat by the window and watched Seoul move past her in the dark. Lit windows, moving people, the particular rhythm of a city doing the ordinary, relentless work of existing. And she was tired in the way that people are tired when the thing they have been fighting is genuinely finished, which is a different kind of tired from the kind you accumulate while the fight is still ongoing. It sits differently. It has a different weight. It permits a quality of rest that the other kind never quite allows. She rested against the window. The city moved. Her reflection moved with it, transparent, over the lit faces of buildings and the dark stretches between them. She thought about her mother's tomatoes in their containers on the Baltimore porch. She thought about the ocean at 12, which she had never heard about until recently, from a man who had not understood until that moment that there were things larger than the problem you were inside. She thought about Danielle's grip, which communicated multiple things simultaneously and was not embarrassed about any of them. She thought about 89 entries, independently corroborated. She thought about the crouch. The bus moved through Seoul. Outside the window, the Han River appeared briefly between buildings. Black water, the lights of bridges, the particular expanse of something that has been there long enough to understand patience. And then it was gone, replaced by the city again, which was always the city again, persistent and indifferent, and full of windows behind which people were doing the private work of surviving their particular lives. She had done that work. She was still doing it, in the different form that it takes when the acute emergency is resolved and the longer, quieter reckoning begins. She was doing it imperfectly, without a manual, making decisions about complicated men and blue notebooks and cafe tables with river views without any guarantee that the decisions were right, only with the hard-earned understanding that she was making them from a position of genuine choice rather than the constrained survival choices of a woman with her back against a stairwell wall. That was different. That mattered. The bus reached her stop. She stood. She held the overhead rail as the bus slowed, and she felt the solidity of it under her palm. Metal, real, the particular temperature of something that has been held by many hands before hers, and she thought that this was what it felt like, finally, to be in a body that was not braced against the next thing. Not relaxed. She was not a person who relaxed easily and had made a certain peace with that, but not braced, not holding the building up with her bare hands. The doors opened. She stepped out into the cold. She walked home. The apartment in Mapogu, which no longer felt temporary and provisional, which had begun in small ways over the past several months to accumulate the texture of a place she lived in rather than a place she was waiting to leave, the cookbook she had bought, the plant on the windowsill that Danielle had brought on her second visit, the photograph on the refrigerator of herself and Danielle at the arrivals hall, both of them slightly red-eyed and entirely unposed, a woman holding her sister in an airport with a force that was entirely uncalculated. She unlocked the door. She went in. She took off her jacket and hung it. She went to the kitchen and made tea, real tea, the kind you drink deliberately, and she took it to the table and sat. She looked at the shelf across the room, at the black and white marbled cover of the notebook beside the blue one. Two objects in a room, ordinary and particular, and charged with everything that ordinary particular objects accumulate when the people who have held them were holding them through something real. She drank her tea. She did not open either notebook. There was nothing left to document, and the silence that fact created in her was not emptiness, but a different texture entirely. The silence of a room that has been cleared of what was cluttering it. The silence that precedes whatever comes next. She did not yet know exactly what came next. She had some information. A cafe at 6:30 a.m., a river view, a man who moved through a complicated world with a certain specific honesty that she had decided, over many mornings, she trusted. A sister who called on Tuesdays and communicated multiple things simultaneously. A job she had applied for, not at Hansong, but at an international health logistics organization with offices in 3 countries, an organization whose name she had first seen in an email from a contact Yoon had introduced her to, an organization that was apparently looking for someone who understood, from the cellular level outward, why supply chain integrity was not an abstract operational concern, but a human one. She did not know yet whether she would get it. She knew she had applied. She knew she had written a cover letter that was the most honest professional document she had ever produced, which included a sentence, carefully worded, Yoon had helped with the wording, about her work on a documentation case that had resulted in institutional reform and the prosecution of multiple executive-level individuals in a major Korean medical facility. She had not named the facility. She had not needed to. The sentence did what it needed to do. She drank the last of her tea. She rinsed the cup. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the Seoul night, which was lit and busy and ongoing, which did not require anything of her tonight except that she be in it, alive, in a kitchen, in a city, with a shelf behind her, and a bus stop a block away, and a phone in her pocket, and a river view available at 6:30 in the morning to anyone who knows to look for it. She was 26 years old. She was from Baltimore. She had come to Seoul because her sister had told her to do something that scared her, something real, something that would mean she had actually lived. She had done that. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming of the stairwell, and when she woke up it was early, earlier than she needed to be anywhere, and the city outside was still in its pre-dawn quiet, and she lay there in the particular honesty of early morning and thought about coffee and a river and a man who had sent a message that said, "I remember," and waited for an answer. She got up. She got dressed. She went out into the cold.